Oh yeah, I'm gonna take you for a ride.
In retrospect, Resident Evil 7 could feel more like a game jam than a complete experience, the developers trading out ideas by the hour. Some sections were excellent, offering a new perspective on an old style, and others? Well, not many games have had such a clear dip in quality. But there was a charming momentum to it, a sense that this was the series reinventing itself, each section a window into what the next Resident Evil game could be. I suppose the hope for RE8 then is that it would sort some of these issues out and focus in on the best elements of its predecessor. The tension of exploring such a lived-in place and the brief jolts of terror and catharsis that could come with combat. And they did, in a sense, combine the best elements of the games, not just 7, but bits and pieces of the whole series, and combine them together into a weird Frankenstein of a thing. This is Resident Evil Village.
Where the hell am I?
So let's start with something so pedantic and boring that only Resi Super fans will care about it. The map. And it's a good map, right? The one that works so well in the remix, that shows you where you've cleared everything out, where there are still items to find, and colors everything accordingly. I hated it. I hated it because it was a great map for the games it was in, where items were generally around eye level, but one that serves to bring the game to a crawl in a title where items can be wedged in the dark corner of a room, or visible only to players who catch the telltale glint of a gem in the ceiling. The good design of another game has been used a little haphazardly here, and in so doing forgets the solution that RE7 offered. Psychostimulants, a rare item that would mark the location of items on your screen. They were perfect for environments that were so packed with detail and debris that it could be hard to parse where items actually were. The map in Village isn't ruinous, but it was a bit of design that grated on me, spending minutes combing over rooms to find a handful of lay. And this was a feeling I experienced again and again, another game's good ideas slotted into Village, without the same considerations given to make them work here. Speaking of which, combat. Rarely has a game made such a poor first impression on me, dying over and over to enemies that were so durable that I felt like I had missed some item or tutorial. It wasn't just the much maligned Lycan ambush that tries and fails to pay homage to Resident Evil 4, but pretty much every combat sequence up until getting the sniper rifle in the castle. Playing on hardcore, enemies just kept marching towards me, walking off shots to the head or getting right back up after being knocked to the ground. Maybe the intent was to make enemies feel powerful, but it makes early game encounters a drag. Enemies that don't meaningfully react to your attacks, so you're left plinking away with your weapon, with feedback that lacks the gory satisfaction of basically every other Resident Evil game. It's especially weird given how willing the game is to brutalize and dismember our protagonist.
Shit!
And yet fighting most enemies feels strangely teen-rated, with none of the interactions, like tripping or delimbing, that gave combat its depth. Adding to this lackluster feel are the death animations, where enemies will keel over in such a limp way that it's hard to tell if they're dead or if they're still weaving their way towards you. It was never something I had a sense of, relying more on the raw-looking item drops to tell if I had killed an enemy. Maybe it sounds a bit sadistic, but compared to the immediate, almost instinctual feedback of the other games, it isn't always clear if you're doing damage, and it can make combat deeply unsatisfying to engage in. It isn't much better on a macro level either. Despite having a decent bestiary, rarely are you forced to fight multiple enemy types together. You aren't, say, staving off a pack of Lycan while trying to get shots off on a lumbering soldat. It makes the standard encounters bleed together, fighting groups of the same enemy, with the occasional crossbow Lycan or heavily armored enemy thrown in. And for all the differences in weapons, where some enemies will wield sickles or swords, there's not really a difference between those with weapons and those without. Ultimately, it's cosmetic. You're prioritizing who's closest to you, rather than trying to pick off one particular enemy from a crowd, as would happen in RE4. Despite spending most of the game fighting Ganados, there were substantial differences in their armor, in their weapons, and in what kind of parasite you might unleash. You could look at something like the water room, and hell, you're already thinking up a plan of where to go and who to fight first. There were fights that forced you to constantly reassess and change your strategy. I don't know if I could say the same of most fights in Village. There is some potential for the different enemy types to create complex and engaging encounters, but rarely does the game do anything clever with its bestiary. You have enemies like the various iterations of the Soldat that are introduced, who could offer a new dimension to combat, and then are promptly forgotten about. Like you're introduced to these jetpack Soldat in a memorable encounter where you have to avoid their attacks on a narrow catwalk, all the while trying to deactivate the turbine above you. And then you never see them again. Maybe it's a brilliant reference to RE4 by so casually tossing this unique enemy aside, but it seems like a waste to never use them again in a different scenario. It would be like fighting the Garrador once and then cutting all the other encounters that played around with how it could be used, that made that enemy what it was. Village gets a lot of the superficial details right. You can barricade some doors and shoot projectiles out of the air, but it fails to provide the interesting decisions and stellar encounter design of the game it's trying so hard to evoke. All that said, there is one section where everything clicks, the Lycan Stronghold. At this point in the game, you'll have amassed a decent arsenal, with weapons strong enough to make combat feel satisfying, fighting the only enemy type in the game that can be dismembered. And importantly, there are a lot of enemies. Any whinging about encounter design is forgotten when a dozen enemies are shuffling towards you, with even more pouring in. It's probably the most tense section in the game, with its ebb and flow where you take out a mass of enemies only to have one blindside you. There are so many enemies, in fact, that this section feels like one of the few where weapons aside from the sniper rifle get a chance to shine, with shotguns to keep enemies at bay and explosives for those grouped together. The level design also proves to be unusually good, with a healthy amount of explosive barrels to utilize and a degree of verticality that gives the player more ways to move around enemies. It's a sequence that combines many of the elements that seem underutilized in the rest of the game, with weapon switching, environmental awareness, and good feedback coming together to make an encounter that's remarkably engaging. I'd argue it's one of the creepier sections too, the Lycan swarming over the ruins in a way that makes them out to be far more menacing than in the village, where they can sometimes look a little out of place. For all that, it's not my favorite part of 8, and it's not any of the confrontations with the Four Lords or the Call of Duty sequences Chris, but rather the time in between, spent exploring the village and the surrounding area. Maybe it's not much of a surprise given how much praise this downtime has received, but it connected with me in a way that none of the other sections did. It's here where the survival horror roots show the most, stretches of quiet navigation and resource gathering interrupted by the sounds of something out in the darkness. It helps that the village is one of the best realized locales in the series, where the opening vista offers a glimpse of each area you'll visit, and where your travels will have you come to appreciate how well considered the space is. The feeling of knowing where the bridges above me led was one of the most gratifying in the game, and from then on I kept on having these minor epiphanies of realizing where I was and what I was looking at. My only criticism with exploration is the inventory management, or lack thereof. The only gear you'll need to worry about are healing items, weapons, and meat. Crafting resources and key items don't take up inventory space. This may sound minor, but it means you rarely have to plan out your trips or even think about inventory management at all. I beat the slob challenge for not moving any items in my inventory totally by accident. It had become that much of a non-issue. While inventory management could be a hassle, it was a vital part of the tension in the other games, having to ditch powerful weapons to carry key items or making dangerous trips back through old areas because you were holding on to too much stuff. Its absence can make exploring the village feel somewhat trivial, hoovering up everything that isn't nailed down, never to return to this part of the map. It's even more apparent in the main areas, like the castle, where the lack of inventory management means the game never capitalizes on the potential of outmaneuvering multiple pursuers. Easily the most tense moment I had in the castle was when I forgot to pick up a key item and had to backtrack, all the while being stalked by Lady D.
The entire bloodline of House Domitresk is done in by the likes of you?
It was exactly the kind of unexpected thrill the game could have had more of if it forced a stricter item limit, thereby making these sorts of trips more likely. On a more positive note, this downtime boasts some of the better enemy arrangements. Breaking into Moreau's lab will see you dealing with enemies in the sky, only for the few bits of shelter to house some threats all their own. There's even a nice fake out as you enter Moreau's lab, only to find a single Lycan guarding a bit of treasure. That's it. And then one of the deadliest enemies in the game wanders in. I suppose it's only natural after all, since this is where you find the Magnum, an extremely powerful but limited use item. Every shot feels like a massive commitment, and finding a single round is a cause for celebration. It's a single example of the game's biggest accomplishment. Resource management and finding treasures feels like it matters, all the way up to the very end. I mentioned in a previous video that my biggest problem with RE7 was that it never felt like there was a final test for all the gear you had saved, the last boss essentially just being a set piece that could function regardless of what weapons you brought in. Here, the final boss puts up a decent fight, cycling through a number of forms and attacks, so much so that using up your healing items and ammo feels like a distinct possibility. It makes bringing in a fully upgraded rifle or case of explosives feel all the more triumphant, the reward for some pragmatic decision-making earlier in the game. And it's made even better by the fact that RE8 boasts a well-balanced economy, where late-game weapons will require a healthy amount of currency to buy and maintain. I may have problems with how they're found and where they're sorted in your inventory, but because of this economy, finding treasures and resources always feels worthwhile. And while the optional bosses are a far cry from the quality of the Miranda fight, mostly consisting of abusing the limits of their AI, the treasures they guard and the resources needed to fight them make for some interesting decisions. Defeat them and upgrade your gear, or save your ammo for another fight. In a way, these considerations tie together the disparate sections of the game, as even if the area I'm in isn't that compelling, there's still treasure to find, fights to optimize, and that final boss to plan for. Well, with one exception. House Beneviento is a place I dread going to, only not for the reasons you might think. After 3 playthroughs, I know what's coming, some puzzles, a big baby, and a rather anticlimactic boss fight. This may sound a little harsh, considering what a thrill this area is on a first playthrough, but it's perhaps the most simplistic section of the bunch. There are no resources to find or enemies to fight. Angie, the boss, is found in the same location every time, meaning that a bit of memorization can see the sequence beaten in under a minute. An in-game challenge even demands it. Even the thoroughly creepy baby is beaten by a U-turn, the level design so linear that there's not really a chance to change your strategy on a subsequent playthrough. The real irony is that, on its own, this section is tremendous. House Beneviento and the opening in the Winter's New House show Capcom's real talent for creating lived-in spaces, and it's certainly the most I've thought about a Resident Evil character's psyche. But wedged into a game that stresses exploration and optimization, House Beneviento has only felt more rigid, more static. The thing is, RE7 already solved this problem. Throughout the game you could find VHS tapes, each one offering a short playable section, far more rigid and narratively focused than the main game.
So, why are we in hell this time? Do you ever prep? What's the prep? Shitty house, spooky sounds? Ooh, is it haunted?
But it struck a great balance. A first playthrough would see you unraveling the mysteries of the Baker estate, with each tape offering a glimpse of some horror that awaited you and a hint of how to overcome it. And then, on the next playthrough, you could just skip them and play without interruptions. It was a clever way of providing both experiences, sections of atmospheric and defenseless exploration that were then made optional for the players who would sink hours into the game. Not to say that the VHS tapes needed to return unchanged, but it was a design choice that demonstrated a real awareness of how players would engage with the game, balancing the experiential with the mechanical. It's a nuance that hasn't made the cut, and the game is weaker for it. It might have been worth reworking some of the optional areas in the village into an alternate path for House Beneviento, a heavily guarded gauntlet for the members of the cult who wanted to avoid the hallucinogens. And then there'd be a choice of which fears you'd want to face, the sheer terror of the house itself or a maze of traps and combat. Something to consider on each playthrough. Of course, creating optional areas is easier said than done, especially in a development environment that had to adapt to COVID.
家で悶々とヴィレッジのことを考えるしかない期間っていうのがもう結構本当ね1ヶ月以上あって。
There was a great video Capcom put out about the challenges the team faced, both due to the new realities of the pandemic and internal pushback towards the direction of the game.
その時にこれはまずいなというのを強く感じました。開発から聞いてた事前の自信とその内容っていうのがやっぱあまりにも乖離している。
I imagine that many of my issues with combat stem from these factors as they tried to find a vision for what it should be in a limited window of time. I also suspect that it's something that could be solved by a sequel, the team learning from their experiences and hopefully having all the time they need to make it. But the deeper stuff, the design that changes by the hour, that surprised me. My Game Jam comment about RE7 from the beginning might have come across as inflammatory, but it really wasn't meant to. The developers themselves acknowledged the limitations of pulling in so many directions, at least in pre-production.
Some things were left straying off course, confused. Some members didn't respond to this well. And in Koshi's words, sometimes it was just utter chaos.
I'm not sure if the development of Village was handled in the same way, but it certainly feels like it. A game that houses so many cool ideas that just crowd each other out. I think Capcom needs to commit to one of these ideas for the duration, because otherwise they'll keep making games like RE8. Games which are more compelling for the promise of their ideas than their actual execution. Thanks for watching.